professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today's episode is the 5th in a 6-episode series on fitness, exercise, and performance. And today's episode is all about recovery. That is, how to maximize your recovery to achieve your fitness and exercise and performance goals, and how to avoid overtraining. Dr. Andy Galpin, great to be back. Today we're discussing recovery. And I'm very excited to have this discussion because, as we know, despite the fact that different types of exercise can be used to trigger different types of adaptation, such as increased long distance endurance, anaerobic capacity, strength, hypertrophy, etc., the workouts themselves are not actually when the progress occurs, when the adaptation occurs. And this to me is extremely interesting because it parallels what we see with so-called neuroplasticity, which is the nervous system's ability to change in response to experience. We sit down to learn something, we experience something, and that is the trigger for rewiring of the nervous system. But the actual rewiring occurs away from the experience or the learning. So too in fitness and in exercise, recovery is where the real results actually emerge, where we get better. So I'd love for you to explain what recovery really is and the different types of recovery, certainly different ways to enhance recovery. And I'd also love for you to explain whether or not there are ways that people can become better at recovering. Because if indeed recovery is when progress emerges, when we get better, well then anything that supports our recovery and gets us better at recovering ought to increase our rate and our degree of progress.
Absolutely. You nailed it in the description. What people really want is some sort of change. Whether you were talking athletes or general population, this change is some sort of improvement in muscle function, reduction in body fat, higher functioning metabolism, whatever the case is. And the only way that happens is we talk about the equation of stress causes adaptation, but as you alluded to, the piece in the middle is only if you can recover from it. And so the game we're playing here is we all agree we want more adaptation. That means we need to bring more stress into the system, but we then have to ensure that our recovery outpaces the stress input, or else no adaptation will occur. And in fact, what happens is you will actually be in a negative spot and start going backwards. And so what I would love to do is talk about how we've handled this. And I've had a decent amount of experience here. I was fortunate enough to do my master's degree in the laboratory of a gentleman named Andy Fry, who's an NSCA Lifetime Achievement Award winner. And he studied in large part recovery, overtraining, overuse, overload in a lot of areas. In addition, I've been fortunate enough to work with individuals from high-functioning CEOs and executives who have little time for recovery, high job stress, to athletes. Think of the example of pitchers in Major League Baseball who have to recover in a matter of 4 days so that they can pitch again at maximum velocity. So I would love to outline some of the tools and tactics, strategies that we use for all these individuals, give you some foundational stuff, and I would love to maybe actually cover some things that most people have never heard of, some stuff you may not have access to, some technologies that we use, some biomarkers, and then even a whole bunch of things that are keeping with the theme of your show here, cost-free or extremely low cost. So all those strategies. What I would also like to do is cover nutrition and supplementation and fueling and hydration and things, but that's probably going to have to be saved for an additional conversation that we'll do in the next episode.
Yes, so we will absolutely hold a conversation about nutrition and supplementation where you can educate us about all the top contour stuff all the way down to the fine details. I do have a question about recovery, and it's one that I think most people are familiar with themselves, which is soreness. We think of it as muscle soreness, but I was trained early on in my scientific career to always question the seemingly obvious. So a couple of questions about soreness. First of all, what does soreness really reflect? Is it really muscle soreness? It feels like it's in the muscles. But what other organ systems and tissues and cell types does it involve? And then I'm particularly interested in this concept or this experience that many of us, including myself, have had, which is delayed onset muscle soreness. Why would it be that when we are less in shape or when we perform a movement that is extremely novel to us, the soreness seems to arrive after a reasonable delay of maybe even a day. We're fine the next day, but then 48 hours later, we are exceedingly sore. And as we get more fit or more familiar with a movement, the soreness seems to arrive earlier. So I realize I just asked you about 3 questions or more. First of all, what is muscle soreness at a cellular level? Which cells, which organ systems, and so forth? What does it mean if we are sore is something I know we'll get into a little bit later. And then why the delayed onset muscle soreness?
It's actually one question. So it's totally fine you asked all 3, because I'm going to actually answer number 3, which will answer number 2, which will actually answer number 1.
I'd love to tell you that I set it up that way intentionally, but I'm just happy to hear that where I was unable to be concise, you are able to be concise. Thank you.
We are still learning a lot about this area. It's actually really difficult to perform these studies. Anytime you ask a question about something like pain or soreness, you're immediately talking about perception. And there is obviously a physical component to that, but then there's also perception. And so teasing those things out is extraordinarily challenging. That said, there has been a lot of work in this area. And in fact, probably you may have a show already out on pain, or maybe one's coming down the road.
We did an episode on pain a while ago, but it's definitely time to revisit that literature. I also have some amazing colleagues at Stanford who work on pain, both from the cellular and molecular side, but also from the psychological side, about how our understanding of pain and what we believe about pain shapes the experience of pain and pain relief.
Amazing. That stuff is incredibly important, and I'm glad we flagged that, and maybe we'll just call that good for now. They could come back later for another one of your shows. So that being said, why does it happen 28 to 48 hours after you exercise? Well, that actually should give you some clues into what's happening. So the traditional dogma of delayed onset muscle soreness is what this is called, is that it is a result of quote unquote micro tears in the muscle. And so you can sort of think, I challenged the muscle, there were some small tears in there, and I'm feeling the results of that. Well, in fact, that certainly does happen, and it can happen. That is not what's explaining your muscle soreness. And in fact, you can be quite sore from exercise and have no measurable amount of muscle damage. And so much like anything else, when we're in this idea of pain, it's not a one-to-one explanation. There are multiple factors that are probably causing your perception of pain. Muscle damage can be one of them. It is not the only one, and it is probably, in my opinion, though this is yet to be shown definitively, probably not even the leading cause of it. And so what's actually happening? Well, the reason it's taking you 24 to 48 hours is you can actually find various papers, literature reviews dating back a number of years now, over a decade, that show these wonderful curves of an inflammatory and immune response. And we don't need to necessarily go through the entire physiology right now, but effectively what's happening is those things have a little bit of a time delay. And so some of those steps happen immediately, like right when the exercise is there, and then some of them are delayed 6 to 24 to 48 hours. If you know a little bit about this physiology, you have a combination of neutrophils and macrophages and a bunch of things happening, and this has a time sequence. So what happens is by the time we get to this 28 to 48 hour window, now the muscle soreness kicks in. Which, wait a minute, if this was a result of my muscles being torn, and that happened immediately, wouldn't that pain start immediately? Well, the answer is it would. And so that is your first clue that that's not responsible for it. When we look at that immune response and we see that is actually peaked 24 to 48 hours later, and then that's the same time the pain kicked in, that's cluing you into the problem. So we have this immune response happening and inflammation. Then all of a sudden we start getting fluid accumulation. And now there are what are called nociceptors, and you're probably obviously you're very familiar with these, and these are your pain receptors. What's actually interesting is we don't necessarily know a lot of information about how many pain receptors are in muscle. They're not really in the belly. In fact, this is why I can perform my muscle biopsies and they don't really hurt.
You mean in the belly of the muscle?
Correct.
Yeah.
We do have pressure sensors though. And so if you change the volume of the tissue, you will respond to that very, very quickly. So by enhancing swelling in the actual muscle, that is immediately putting pressure on those pressure receptors, if you will. That's the signal. So what's probably happening here, and I just hate to give you another bone, but a lot of delayed onset muscle soreness is probably just a neural feedback loop rather than it is actual muscle damage.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of interactions between the types of neurons that control touch sensation and pain sensation and itch sensation. In fact, a lot of people kind of collapse itch and pain together.
Bingo. Yeah.
You know, that's something, it's painful and it itches is a familiar thing for people, mosquito bites and such.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the classic gate theory of pain, which people will be familiar with. And then I'll explain why I'm explaining this, which is if you something hurts, you bonk your knee or you stub your toe, we tend to grab that body part and try and rub it.
Totally.
And that rubbing is not a coincidental thing. It activates a set of touch sensors that respond to kind of broad, dull touch. And that actively inhibits, through the release of an inhibitory neurotransmitter, the fibers that control the pain signal. So anytime we rub like a Charlie horse our leg, or we stub our toe and we wince and then we grab the toe and we kind of like squeezing it a little bit, that's actually deactivating or partially inactivating the pain mechanism. So the idea that a swelling response would then trigger a neural response that then would recruit the pain receptor response. Here I'm using broad brush strokes here to explain this. Makes very good sense to me now, and only now that you've explained how this process works.
I can actually even add more to that. So if you remember how muscles work, so we have to have some sort of signal from the nervous system that has to actually go in and tell the muscle to contract. Well, remember there a few episodes ago we covered the physiology here of what's called a motor unit. Okay, well, what I didn't explain to you are called muscle spindles. And we have talked about proprioception in an episode before as well, but we never tied this picture together. So let me walk you through that really quickly, and it's going to tie this loop into a nice bow. So what happens is this motor unit is coming in from what's called an alpha motor unit, and that's going to be innervating your muscle fibers, and that's going to tell the muscle fibers to contract. Those are typically spread out throughout the all sides of the muscle, interior, exterior, all over. On the outside, though, there is another type of muscle called a muscle spindle. Now, these are non-contractile, so they don't have that actin and myosin, and they don't produce force. They are responsive, they are proprioceptive. So what that means is they sense stretch. And this is why, for example, if you were to stretch a hamstring, stretch any muscle group, it doesn't really matter, or muscle, its innate response is to fire back to close that distance. And this is what keeps you from, say, if you're leaning to the right, you can imagine that the example we give is if you're standing on one foot and you start swaying to the right. All right, let's say you're standing on your right foot, and this makes this easier for folks. And you start swaying to the right, like you're going to fall on your right ear will hit the ground. The inside of your right calf muscle will start being stretched. The outside will start being compressed, right? So the stretch on the inside of the right calf muscle will sense that stretch, and it will respond by contracting. That pulls you back to the middle and stops you from falling. That's proprioception, and muscle spindles sense stretch and tell you to contract. The way that they work is through gamma motor neurons. And so these are sensory things. So what's happening is, unlike when you tell your muscle to contract, it goes alpha to the muscle, contract. These muscle spindles work such that it is, I've been stretched, send signal back to some central point, typically in the spinal cord. And we don't actually want to go all the way up to the brain. We've got a time delay. This is why these are subconscious, autonomic, right? Versus somatic. So the gamma is going to go back to the central location and then come back through the alpha motor neurons and tell it to contract. So you have this wonderful mechanism of sensing stretch going back. Well, one theory that's been put forward regarding muscle damage is that the pressure is actually being applied to those nerve endings of the muscle spindles. And that's actually responsible for the pain signal that's going back and coming up to your brain, and you're registering that as pain, rather than it is actually in the contractile units, so the muscle fibers.
That's a very intriguing idea because it would suggest that stretching muscles in order to alleviate soreness might be the exact incorrect thing to do.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that's for certain. I'm just building off the mechanistic logic that we've laid out here.
Yeah.
Really, that you've laid out here.
There's the more effective principle based on exactly that, which is this is generally why low-level movement is effective at reducing acute soreness.
Because that's low-level contraction of the muscles.
And you're going to
anti-stretch
and get tissue out, and you get fluid out.
Wow.
You're literally pumping it out of the cell.
Yes, and in our previous episode where we were talking about programming, or I keep using the we, but let's be fair here, where you were educating us, including me, and the audience about different structures for programming, exercise, for specific adaptations, et cetera, the month, week, year, scales, et cetera. We had a brief discussion about the fact that if one trains legs very hard with resistance training, some heavy squatting or deadlifting it, and there's some soreness, that oftentimes doing some quote unquote lighter cardio or some low impact work the next day, or any number of different things that involve not high intensity contractions of the muscles, but that do require contractions of the muscles, that it can alleviate soreness more quickly than if one were to simply lie around and watch Netflix or something.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The to go back just a little bit as well, if that's really the case, the question is like, where is this inflammatory signal coming from? And while there's much to be learned there, there is a little bit of information right now that suggests it's potentially coming from free radicals released from the mitochondria. Again, that may or may not hold up as more research comes. I'm not sure. But if you remember back to our conversation on endurance, so we talked about the electron transport chain and aerobic metabolism, and regardless of whether or not you're getting energy from glycolysis or carbohydrates, remember, they have to be finished through aerobic metabolism. So even if you're lifting weights and you're using carbs for your fuel, you have got to finish that metabolism by running it into the mitochondria and performing oxidative metabolism. As a result of that, that electron transport chain runs. So theoretically, if free radicals, which are hyperreactive oxygen species, basically they're oxygen molecules that are missing an electron so that they react to a lot of things. They're the opposite of antioxidants, by the way. This is the oxygen molecules with extra protons so they can balance the charge. If those leak out, that in and of itself is going to be a massive inflammatory signal, and that's probably what signals the cause of these neutrophils and macrophages and kicks off this entire cascade. Again, I believe we need more research there. I need to look into it. Maybe it's more definitive than I know. But that's probably what's happening, potentially what's happening, rather, that causes that cascade in signal. Also, what you have is this combination of, well, if that's the case, why am I not getting tremendous amount of muscle damage when I do more aerobic-based exercise? Well, because you don't have the mechanical tension pulling on the fibers that's actually causing damage to the cell wall that allows these free radicals to escape the mitochondria and the cell wall. So that's the best we can postulate at this moment as to why those things are happening. And then why, again, low-level exercise tends to enhance even things like percussion. So using either instruments that put a low level of vibration into your leg, or like pneumatic boots, so you massage, all these things are generally probably helping because they're moving that stuff out, edema most specifically. So pressure comes off of those nerve endings in the muscle spindles and allows you to stop receiving that signal of pain, despite the fact that you didn't actually regenerate tissue at all yet.
Fascinating. And I think that beautifully frames where we're headed next, which is to talk about all the different modes of recovery and how to accelerate them, and perhaps even how to combine different forms of recovery in order to become better at recovering, and in doing so, make faster progress with fitness. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is also separate from Dr. Andy Galpin's teaching and research roles at Cal State Fullerton. It is, however, part of our desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, we'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Our first sponsor is Momentous. Momentous makes supplements of the absolute highest quality. The Huberman Lab podcast is proud to be partnering with Momentous for several important reasons. First of all, as I mentioned, their supplements are of extremely high quality. Second of all, their supplements are generally in single ingredient formulations. If you're going to develop a supplementation protocol, you're going to want to focus mainly on using single ingredient formulations. With single ingredient formulations, you can devise the most logical and effective and cost-effective supplementation regimen for your goals. In addition, Momentous supplements ship internationally. And this is, of course, important because we realize that many of the Huberman Lab podcast listeners reside outside the United States. If you'd like to try the various supplements mentioned on the Huberman Lab podcast, in particular supplements for hormone health, for sleep optimization, for focus, as well as a number of other things, including exercise recovery, you can go to Live Momentous, spelled O-U-S, so that's livemomentous.com/Huberman. Today's episode is also brought to us by Element. Element is an electrolyte drink that contains the exact ratios of the electrolytes sodium, magnesium, and potassium to optimize cellular functioning for mental and physical performance. Most people realize that hydration is key. We need to ingest enough fluids in order to feel our best and perform our best. But what most people do not realize is that the proper functioning of our cells and nerve cells, neurons in particular, requires that sodium, magnesium, and potassium be present in the correct ratios. Now, of course, people with prehypertension and hypertension need to be careful about their sodium intake. But what a lot of people don't realize is that if you drink caffeine, if you exercise, and in particular, if you're following a very clean diet, that is not a lot of processed foods, which of course is a good thing, chances are you're not getting enough sodium, potassium, and magnesium to optimize mental and physical performance. Element contains a science-backed ratio of 1,000 milligrams, that's 1 gram of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium, and no sugar. If you'd like to try Element, you can go to Drink Element, that's lmnt.com/Huberman, to get a free Element sample pack with your purchase. Again, that's Drink Element, lmnt.com/Huberman, to claim a free sample pack. Today's episode is also brought to us by 8 Sleep. 8 Sleep makes smart mattress covers with cooling, heating, and sleep tracking capacity. I've been using an 8 Sleep mattress cover for about the last 8 months, and it has completely transformed my sleep. I'm sleeping about the same amount, but I'm sleeping far deeper, and I'm now getting the proper ratios of so-called rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, and slow wave sleep, and waking up feeling far more recovered mentally and physically. The underlying mechanism for all that is very straightforward. I've talked many times before on this podcast and elsewhere about the critical relationship between sleep and body temperature. That is, in order to fall asleep at night, your body needs to drop by about 1 to 3 degrees in terms of core body temperature, and waking up involves a 1 to 3 degree increase in core body temperature. With 8 Sleep mattress covers, you can adjust the temperature of your sleeping environment to be one temperature at the start of the night, a different temperature in the middle of the night, and a different temperature as you approach morning, each of which can place you into the optimal stages of sleep and have you waking up feeling more refreshed than ever. If you'd like to try 8 Sleep, you can go to 8sleep.com/Huberman and check out their Pod 3 cover and save $150 at checkout. 8 Sleep currently ships in the USA, Canada, United Kingdom, select countries in the EU, and Australia. Again, that's 8sleep.com/Huberman to save $150 at checkout. So to kick off this discussion about recovery, and with the understanding that recovery is when the specific adaptations to exercise actually occur, I'd love for you to share with us what happens or needs to happen during recovery in order for us to get better at anything, endurance, strength, etc., but also how specific types of exercise stimuli and specific types of adaptations that we trigger, so running a bit further, lifting a bit more weight, slowing the cadence of a given movement, etc., how those specific types of triggers for adaptation relate to the specific or maybe similar types of recovery that are required for us to make progress.
In one of our previous episodes, we were talking about how the Harvard Fatigue Lab really identified this idea of homeostasis, or at least sort of championed it for it. And that's important because in all levels, physiology wants to return to homeostasis. So what happens in terms of adaptation is you've challenged it to a level that it realizes if it does not make a change, it will not be able to get back to a same level of homeostasis. That's fundamentally what's happening. That is recovery. That process of taking an insult, being temporarily reduced in functionality, causing a change so that now we come back and get what we often call in sport performance super compensation. All that really is doing, though, is bringing you to a new level of homeostasis. Effectively, it is understanding if that same insult comes again, I need to be able to make sure that that doesn't cause the same level of disruption. And so we raise the bar, whether this is enhancing our ability to take the same level of mechanical tension on the muscle and not result in micro damage, whether this is being able to take the same reduction in energy and not have that compromise sleep or anything. It's really fundamentally changing so that we can have a new level of homeostasis because it's predicting that that same insult is going to come again down the road.
I wanted to clarify for people that when Dr. Galpin says insult, while he may actually insult me, insult is the nerd speak terminology for some sort of damage inflicted to a tissue or system. So he's speaking about the insult to the muscle or insult to the neuromuscular connection created by adding more weight to the bar, running a further distance, running a bit faster or pedaling faster. That creates a micro insult or an insult. And now, because everyone is familiar with psychological and verbal insults, you'll never forget that biological concept.
It's important we tag another thing here, which is called hormesis. It's one of my favorite phenomenon, and it effectively means this, that there is a dosage or toxicity response to almost everything. And if you think about this in the context of, say, drugs, what this means is if I gave you 10 milligrams of something, that it would be okay. But if I give you 20, it'd be a problem. And eventually, if I go up and give you enough, this thing turns toxic. This is a case of everything from cyanide, where it can actually be in small dosages in nature. In fact, it's in many of the fruits that you eat, but it's at a dosage that it doesn't matter. If that dosage gets higher, though, that actually can cause problems. And if it is high enough, it can actually kill you instantaneously. The back end of that, though, is because you introduce this micro insult, as you framed it for me perfectly, your body will then adapt to it. And that's really what's happening with exercise adaptation is it is a hormetic stressor. And why that's important is if you look at the immediate responses to exercise, you see an extremely large increase in inflammation. You see oxidative stress. You see a whole cascade of autophagy, like all these problems, quote unquote, happen. And it's that what's actually quite funny here is, as a part of my PhD, the academic portion, I had to go through the medical side of the school. And so my physiology class was in med school. So I'm the only non-medical doctor in that class, right? I'm a PhD. So I leave my lab, I walk across campus, and I take physiology class with these folks. And I died the whole time internally because every time we would cover a new area, it was basically the exact same value or number in a medical setting is like, oh my gosh, they're going to die. And in a performance setting is like, this person's in fantastic shape. It's like, I've never, it still amuses me to this day, obviously, because it's just simple things like total blood volume, right? And you cover like, okay, if you have a patient come in, their blood volume is 6 liters, immediately get them on a diuretic of some sort because they're going to have a heart attack as blood pressure gets up, right? And I'm immediately thinking, damn, 6 liters, that person is super fit. Because that is actually a positive adaptation to training. It's one of the most important, if not the most important adaptation to endurance training is enhanced total blood volume. So you'll store more blood in your body when you're more fit than you are less fit. So I mean, I could go on. All these things, sodium concentrations, potassium concentrations, are like, you look at these things on paper and you don't know if that person's about to die because they're 65 years old and out of shape, or if that person's going to break a world record in the marathon.
This brings up a very important tangent, which is, for instance, if you go and take a blood test and you are somebody who exercises very intensely with resistance training, your blood creatinine levels can be way out of range. Yeah. And if your physician doesn't know that you're doing certain forms of exercise, might say, wow, there's a lot of muscle tissue damage occurring in your body.
Yeah.
As you mentioned before, your total blood volume is dangerously high, when in fact you are far healthier and indeed much fitter than the person whose numbers would be in range. That said, obviously there are limits to these statements whereby you would want to be cautious and take action to ameliorate a very elevated blood creatinine level or something of that sort. But the point you're bringing up is also one about the field of medicine, which is that many, not all, but many physicians don't take into consideration the outside activities that people are doing. And so it becomes a kind of plug and play type way of looking at blood charts.
Yeah, we've done many thousand athletes' blood chemistry. And we don't use, first of all, we never look at disease stuff. That's not what we do. We take people that are healthy and try to optimize performance. And blood chemistry is one of the best tools. If you really understand what you're doing there, you can get some incredibly powerful information out of blood chemistry. That actually relates to what we're going to talk to today in terms of measuring everything from acute to chronic dehydration to sleep deprivation can be identified in blood chemistry, to optimization, improvements in nutrition, supplementation. There's just a lot you can get there. If people are interested in that field, I'd point them to a gentleman named Dan Garner, who's just an absolute juggernaut and wizard in blood chemistry for high performance. But you can get a ton of information from that if you understand the difference between exactly what you talked about, looking for signals of increased risk of cardiovascular events 25 years down the road versus is this the optimal value for high performance in an athlete, which is what our database and all of our software and stuff does, is only looking for those things. So I'm going to talk about some of the biomarkers to look for a little bit later, salivary stuff, some blood stuff, but we'll maybe save that part of the conversation for down the road.
Tell me about different time scales of recovery.
Sure. This is actually where I was trying to answer your question before, and then I got myself way off track. But the reason I brought up the hormetic thing is if you understand that some things in the acute, say 24 to 48-hour period, look terrible, it's actually fine, right? So this is the stimuli that's causing adaptation. So the reason I brought up the medical exchange there is because if you looked at inflammatory markers and then you mentioned some of them, you would see that they are highest acute within seconds to minutes to hours after exercise. However, that's exactly the stimuli needed to bring them down chronically. Okay, and so chronically meaning maybe in that moment they are elevated, and then maybe they're coming down 24 hours later and 48 hours. However, if you were to compare your resting level, say that Monday before you worked out, to your resting level that Monday the week following that, what you would probably see is your baseline inflammation goes down. And so we got to be really careful. Are we talking immediately post-exercise? Man, these markers look terrible. Maybe my recovery score is awful, etc. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because what we're looking to do is to not only change what's happening today, but we're trying to cause adaptation that may take us weeks or months to actually access.
I love that you're highlighting this principle, because one of the more obvious ones to me now that you've said this is heart rate.
Absolutely.
If my heart rate goes very, very high during exercise, and I do that fairly consistently or even semi-consistently, my resting heart rate will actually be quite a bit lower.
That's a fantastic example. Really what you're getting at here is this concept where I think it's important to differentiate between adaptation and optimization. Now we hear that word and I use it and most scientists hate it, but it's a good communication tool, optimization. If you're optimizing for the current moment, you're almost surely compromising delayed adaptation, right? If I were to say, do the thing right now that makes you feel the absolute best in the world, and you're like, great, you took a nap and you ate a donut, like, awesome, you feel amazing. But you know it's causing long-term issues. The same can be said on the back end. If you're never choosing things that make you better right now, you're never actually going to see any adaptation. So what we're really doing with this recovery conversation is playing this game of balancing immediate gratification with delayed gratification. And how do we identify how much to do now versus not? How do I use a value or a marker, whether this is how tired I feel today, how sore I am today, versus a score on an app or a tracking metric, whether this is a blood marker, anything, and understand if that's what I need to cause the adaptation I want a week, a month, 3 months from now. And in the case of some of our other athletes, it's even up to 4 years, right? We're trying to cause adaptations that will get us where we want to get in the Olympics or World Championships or World Cup or wherever we're going to be. So that's the framework we have to think about recovery. We maybe falsely think about it as I need to maximize my recovery today. And you could do something like take an anti-inflammatory, whether this is a supplementation or a drug, or maybe this is ice. Oh, cool. That's great. That will enhance your recovery in this moment. That'll make you feel better today, probably tomorrow. But what we know is that blocks the signal for adaptation. So you're not going to get the same results, 4, 6, 8 weeks from now. So when we talk about recovery, we have to understand what tool am I using and why. And in order to do that, we have to understand what am I training for and what am I trying to maximize. If I am in the middle of a season with an athlete and we are competing tomorrow, I am going to hedge towards acute recovery, right? Because I have to actuate that performance right now. If I am starting the off season, I'm not hedging towards recovery. I'm actually hedging towards adaptation. So we're not going to deploy any of these, especially things like there's evidence that a combination of vitamin C and vitamin E will blunt hypertrophic adaptations because they're anti-inflammatory, they're antioxidants, right? Other studies have shown maybe they don't have an inhibitory effect, but they may or may not. Point is, conceptually, you want to be careful of what you're trying to optimize for. And you have to have that forethought, and that alone is going to dictate your decision-making with whether or not, again, you get in the ice, You do that. Now, we will cover some tools like massage that are pretty fine to use. You don't have to worry about those blocking long-term adaptation, but others you're going to want to be very careful about.
So this principle that you've laid out for us, which is that there's a set of events that occur during exercise that trigger the adaptation. And that sets in motion a number of adaptations that occur during recovery that then give us the exact opposite response to what the trigger was. Exactly. So I'll go back to the heart rate example. Heart rate is close to maximal or maximal. You do that enough times within a short, a week or so or 2 weeks, and your resting heart rate goes down. As I recall, a few episodes ago, you said that your maximum heart rate doesn't really change that much. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. But your resting heart rate can go down quite a bit.
Yep.
Is that a general theme? Meaning, do we have a more or less set upper limit or ceiling for things like inflammatory markers, for heart rate, maybe even things like stress? And what we do when we deliberately trigger stress or a dramatic increase in heart rate or dramatic increase in inflammatory markers is that we are lowering the floor, but that the ceiling remains the same?
It's very dependent upon the marker. So in the case of maximum heart rate, it will not change with the exception of one thing, which is age. Age brings it down. Training will not change it up in most circumstances. If you look at something like an inflammatory response, I suppose theoretically there is a ceiling, though I'm not aware of it. I can tell you right now, looking at blood markers, things like creatine kinase. So remember the conversation about metabolism and that we use phosphocreatine as one of our primary fuel sources for explosive exercise. Well, if we're using phosphocreatine, this creatine kinase, now remember kinase are enzymes that function to break things down for the most part. So creatine kinase is the enzyme you use to break down creatine. Well, when you do that a lot, then that creatine kinase gets out of muscle and seeps into the blood. Myoglobin is actually another fantastic marker, by the way. Myoglobin is, if you think about hemoglobin being in blood, is the molecule that carries oxygen around. When it's in the muscle tissue, then it's myoglobin, myo meaning muscle, and it's the same globulin thing. So there's a bunch of markers you can look at muscle breakdown, and one of the things that you can see is a creatine kinase level that's elevated after, say, one bout of exercise, and it might be up, 5 or 6 fold. I've actually seen this number in offensive linemen in the NFL be something like 500 plus fold. So even within just one category to the next, that number can get extraordinarily high. And if you know, this is actually one important point here. If you're paying attention to any mechanistic research or you're using that to inform your decision making, you have to be extraordinarily careful of magnitude. And what I mean by that is, if I were to be running a Western blot looking at a signaling protein in a muscle, did this activation of this protein turn on mitochondrial biogenesis? And I saw that whatever intervention we gave it, whether it was a nutrition thing or a drug or an exercise, and I saw that signaling protein increased by 20%. I would basically assume that to be totally physiologically irrelevant. Because in order for that to be important, it totally depends on the marker you're looking at, but some markers I might need to see 400, 500, 600-fold increase before I know that will actually be enough to be what we call physiologically relevant. Others, if they're up 1 or 2%, that is relevant. And so you really want to be careful when you're either reading papers or looking at social media stuff. If people are just talking about this marker increased this much, it may not matter. It may be totally irrelevant physiologically. And so you have to, that's also if you're wondering, like, how the hell are all these people? Well, that's how they can trick you a little bit, intentionally or not. It could be just they're trying to do their best, but they don't really understand that area enough. And so that's an important point to pay attention to. So to answer your question again fully, it would be hard to determine if there is truly a maximum level. Some things don't want to move, like blood pH. It doesn't really want to move. The range that you're going to move from is, like 6.8 to 7.4. And if you get up to like 7.9, like you're probably in big trouble. Other things, again, can go up 500, 5,000-fold. And so the markers will really determine that answer.
Well, at some point in the future, I'd love to continue this discussion around the topic of stress specifically.
Yeah.
And maybe we will get into that a little bit later today when we get into the use of deliberate cold exposure, because that certainly has effects related directly to temperature on tissue, but it certainly has mental effects in terms of raising one's level of perceived pain.
It's fun. It's also good.
Or some people love it, and some people love it for the feeling they get during it. Deliberate cold exposure, some people only like it for the feeling that they get after it. Not unlike exercise.
Totally.
I love to train. I love exercise, but I know many people who they loathe exercise, but they love the feeling afterward. So this will be a theme that we will come back to. Thank you for indulging my interest in that semi-tangent. I think it's a relevant tangent, if there is such a thing. You can now return us to the different time scales and modes of recovery, because I think where we are headed is how to get better at recovering.
Yep. Let's talk about the tools. Let's talk about what to measure and identify for all 4 of these distinct levels. So level 1 is what we call overload. And just very quickly, what that means is I did a workout today. The sign and symptom of overload is you're fatigued, acute performance is down. So I worked out hard right now. If I were to go try to do a maximum effort, I would be reduced in my ability. The recovery period for acute overload is minutes to days, right? That's generally what we call acute overload. And that's what we're looking for, right? So system should theoretically see that hormetic stressor, come back in response, come back bigger, better, more efficient, etc. If you were to continue training in that state, like most of us do, and say I did a workout today, I had a little bit of acute overload. Going to work out again tomorrow, a little more acute overload. Going to work out the next day, a little more acute overload. Even if you took a day in between, that doesn't matter, right? You just continue these acute bouts of insult. Then you're going to be pushing into the absolute golden target, which is what we call functional overreaching. So you have overreached what you can currently do, and it results in a functional outcome. And what we mean functionally here is performance is enhanced. And again, performance being whatever you deem it to be. You're stronger, you've enhanced muscle size, your mitochondria has improved, whatever the thing is. It's not just a physical performance thing, right? Amazing. Recovery time for functional overreaching is typically a few days to maybe even a week or so. And so typically what we see happen is prior to a competition, individuals will do what we call a taper, which is a reduced training volume for some short period of time. And the reason they do that is to, again, actualize, is the phrase we use here, the adaptations. And so you worked hard for 6 weeks, and theoretically the workouts you did 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks ago, once you allow the system to recover, will be actualized, which means your performance will be enhanced here. So functional overreaching is the golden target. Okay, if you were to be at the point of functional overreaching and you continue to train, so it intensified, whether this is through intensity, this is through volume, or really, as we said earlier, you had something holding back your recovery. It doesn't really matter, right? It's sort of 2 sides of the same coin. Then you would move into what we call non-functional overreaching. So you've overreached again, but now it is non-functional, as in you did not see a positive benefit once recovery allowed. This typically means you have weeks. It takes weeks to come back from, and you basically just get back to baseline. And this is where a lot of folks are who end up in this vicious cycle. And so you're like, man, I'm not getting the results I want. I'm going to train harder. I'm not getting the results I want. I'm going to train harder and harder. But because recovery isn't improved, you just end up in the same spot. So then you train more, and you end up in the same spot, and you end up then just either blowing up or quitting, and you're not getting where you want. If you were to continue past that point, you may actually be into what we actually call overtraining. And that typically is considered to be overtrained if it takes months to recover from. So most people think they're overtrained, are really not. You're just probably non-functionally overreached. And again, the classic distinction is if you took 3 or 4 days off and you felt better, you weren't probably quote unquote overtrained. You were probably just in this area of non-functional overreaching. You need a little bit of a back off. If you, and this has been the case, I've had this happen with gymnasts and a cheerleader and some other things where they take a month off and we're barely seeing them start to come back to their baseline numbers in any number of areas: mood, desire to train, testosterone, cortisol ratios, biomarkers in a number of areas, physical performance, vertical jump height, like all these things. They just start to get back to baseline. So true overtraining is actually quite rare. Non-functional overreaching is much more common. and it is a shorter time frame scale. So when we talk about recovery, those are the 4 pieces that we're really thinking about. And so if you are concerned about, oh, I'm super sore, how do I get less sore? How do I either not be as sore next time I do that same workout, or I'm super sore and now how do I recover? Those are playing in that first category of overload. And we can certainly talk about how to figure that out, but the quick answer is you got to go back to our previous episodes and just pay attention to the volume intensity recommendations. If you're getting significantly more damage or fatigue in a workout, you probably have increased your volume too quickly, or something else is dragging your stress bucket down. But generally, this is a problem of training. You either didn't warm up sufficiently, your fueling strategy is off, which we'll talk about in the next episode, or you've violated one of our principles of increasing intensity and volume sort of too quickly. If it's past that, and you're getting to a stage where you're just like, I'm feeling beat up all the time, my energy is going down, I'm just not feeling like I'm recovered, now we're in this overreaching stage. So the story I kind of tell here always is a few years ago I was working, and my wife Natasha was in the garage training, and I'm doing something, and like she comes stumbling, and she has this look on her eyes, and they're like giant, her eyeballs are giant, she's just like wobbling, and she's like, I effed up. And I was like, what do you mean you like effed up? And she's just like, I read the program wrong. And she's like, I'm like, what'd you do? Like, she was supposed to be doing 10 sets of 3 every minute on the minute, and she did 3 sets of 10 every minute on the minute, and she was absolutely wrecked. She couldn't move for a few hours afterwards, and then for days she's just like, you have to handle the kids. Like, I can't get out of bed, I can't move. So that was like a classic example of, all right, like, we don't need to fix recovery here. You're just a dummy, and you did the training way too hard, too long. Like, this is not, we don't have a problem here. So if it's a situation like that, it's generally the program was way off. If it's constantly happening, where you're just like, man, like, for whatever reason, every once in a while I'm getting really sore or having a really bad performance in these workouts, then we need to go to our other stress bucket, take a look at our allostatic load or allostasis, and get figured out what's happening there. So those are the easy ways to flag acute overload problems.
I'd like to take a brief break and acknowledge our sponsor, Athletic Greens. Athletic Greens is a vitamin, mineral, probiotic, and adaptogen drink designed to help you meet all of your foundational nutritional needs. I've been taking Athletic Greens daily since 2012, so I'm delighted that they're a sponsor of this podcast. The reason I started taking Athletic Greens and the reason I still take Athletic Greens once or twice a day is that it helps me meet all of my foundational nutritional needs. That is, it covers my vitamins, my minerals, and the probiotics are especially important to me. Athletic Greens also contains adaptogens, which are critical for recovering from stress, from exercise, from work, or just general life. If you'd like to try Athletic Greens, you can go to athleticgreens.com/Huberman to claim a special offer. They'll give you 5 free travel packs, and they'll give you a year's supply of vitamin D3K2. Again, if you'd like to try Athletic Greens, go to athleticgreens.com/Huberman to claim the special offer. I'm happy that you pointed out the distinction between functional overreaching, overtraining, and being overtrained. I think one common mistake that people make in thinking about biology generally is that they think in terms of nouns and adjectives and not verbs.
Amazing. I love that so much.
You know, biology is a collection of processes or processes, depending on who you are and where you live and who you trained with. Being overtrained is a state that in many ways is an adjective. You're overtrained. I'm overtrained. It's like saying, I'm an American, I'm a, Czechoslovakian, whatever it happens to be, right? And in many ways, people do start to associate with an identity, at least a transient identity. And they start making all sorts of decisions, it sounds like, about what sorts of verbs they will and will not engage in. Whereas I think if we look at things as processes and we assign verbs to them, then we can say, okay, I'm functionally overreaching, or I'm truly overtraining, which is just a matter of degrees.
Correct.
Right? Or undertraining for that matter. I'm reaching, but I'm not functionally reaching. It's just performance. And just as with the nervous system won't change unless you give it a reason to. This is the reason why if you can perform something perfectly or speak a language perfectly, there's no rewiring of the nervous system. This myth that we've all been told that every experience rewires your nervous system, it's different now than it was 2 seconds ago. That's a ridiculous, illogical statement. We know that's not true. if your nervous system can perform something, it has no reason to change, and it won't.
Muscle's the same way. This is why you have to progressively overload. You have to learn something new or challenge your muscle to do something new. It's same thing.
So in the example that you gave with your wife doing this workout that turned out to be far more strenuous, she had functionally overreached. In some sense, she might have been overtraining or heading in the direction of overtraining, but the mistake would be to assume that she was overtrained, right? As a kind of, it almost becomes a bit of a state or a character assignment as opposed to a verb. And in any case, there's no perfect way to describe this. We're talking about nouns and adjectives, and we're also talking about verbs, but I think the verbs are really anchored down in processes and things that we do, actions that we can take. And so if I may, I'd like to just highlight this idea of shifting one's thinking towards verb actions rather than labels on the state that we happen to be in or the person that we happen to be, right? Sometimes it even does become kind of characterological in the way that people describe it. And so I have to believe that there is something called overtraining, that overtraining is real, in other words, but that we don't ever really know if we're overtrained.
You nailed it.
There's no, it's not like a red flag, shoots up out of your shoulder and it's like, I'm overtrained. It's, so in doing so, I hope that we can start thinking about some of the verbs, the actions that we can all take in order to ensure that we stimulate progressive overload one way or another. And at the same time, that we don't fall into these bins of character assignment where suddenly we decide that we need to do X, like take a month off or something like that. Because I'm beginning to realize from our discussion that that's exactly the wrong way to go.
Those are fantastic points. I want to make sure it is clear that there is no clinical diagnoses for overtraining. There are no standards. There's no test or a blood panel you can pull that would actually identify you in that state. So your distinction here, Andrew, of these are verbs and rather than nouns is so wonderful because that is exactly the case. The only way we could really come retroactively diagnose one with overtraining is if, again, you did weeks of recovery and you only got back to baseline. So we can't do it in the moment. I can't take a single test. There's no subjective marker or anything that says you are overtrained. It is simply you are probably overtraining, and we need to reverse that quickly. Or in the case of the step before, you are probably non-functionally overreaching, and if you continue to do this, you will probably enter into a stage where you're overtraining, and we need to come back. So that's an important thing to let people know is there's no one thing we can actually point to that says you are here. You are not a noun. This is a verb.
So what are some tools that we can use to enhance our recovery?
Yep, let's start off with that acute overload phase. So in other words, I just did a workout and I'm feeling awful, or I just did one 2 days ago and I'm super sore. How do I get rid of that right now? Well, there's a couple of things you can do immediately after your workout, and then others that are maybe more actionable a day later or 2 days later. And we'll just cover a handful of them. We'll do some nutrition and hydration and supplementation in the next episode. I'm going to cover everything else not in that category right now. So a couple of things. Number one, you can actually kickstart that recovery process at the end of your current training session. And I guess I should say it this way. I strongly suggest you start this recovery process immediately after the workout. You mentioned earlier about this idea of you got to get a really high peak of stress to cause adaptation. But I actually didn't explain that correctly, because what has to happen is you need that extremely high peak, but then you have to be met with an extremely sharp recovery back down. And so, you've talked about this before in some of your neuroplasticity stuff, and in terms of what has to happen that caused the insult, and then you immediately need to be able to recover to make sure that causes changes in the brain. Same thing happens here. So we need a really sharp and high inflammatory response, and then if you do not meet it with an immediate recovery period, the signal won't be there to maximize your results. So what's that mean? You can actually do a couple of things. Number one is actually listening to slow-paced music. There's evidence to suggest fast-paced music may slow down your recovery, and slow pace would actually enhance it. So if you just change from, your maximum, get you up and get going music during the workout to a slower, lower cadence, that will help you kickstart the idea. Of a similar note, you can also use what we call down regulation breathing. You could do them in conjunction or one or the other, whichever is up to you. So my personal favorite method here is somewhere between 3 to 10 minutes of finishing your training session, laying down. I'd like to be in that position. You could certainly do it in the lotus position, but I think laying on your back is generally more effective. Personal preference there, no science. I like the eyes being covered, getting into this dark, quiet sort of area. And then just breathing through your nose in a structure